Hello, everyone. So, today's class, let us try to understand a very simple topic in psychology, which is the process of memorization. As we all know, when you talk about memory, it's the process of how you encode, how you store, and how you retrieve the information. That's countable for memory. So, what are some of the factors or the reasons or the uh, ways or the factors which help us to make the memory process little easier when you talk about something which is very complex in nature to encode it in our memory. So the process of memorization, it is merely in the terms of reproduction and revival of the past experiences or the learning which has already taken place. So, when you talk about these factors, there are four important factors: learning, retention, recall, and recognition. So, these are the factors which help us to make the memorization easier. So, let us try to understand each one of them. So, when you talk about learning, it is nothing but acquiring an experiences. It's the basic idea of getting the information processed in your memory. So when you talk about the retention here, it is nothing but it conserves any information in forms of traces or anagram in the picture, in the symbol, in the form of a signal, anything which is leading or using traces by our CNS is also called as retention. And this is two important forms wherein we actually retrieve the information, which is recall and the recognition. So through which the memory traces will be retrieved in our consciousness as sensory images or the impulses. In short, it is nothing but the sensory images after some time which we try to recall. And there is something called as recognition. There is a mild difference between recall and the recognition, which as a recognition help us for process of recall very easier and simple. Why? Out of certain stimulus around us, we try to probably select the specific information which we need to retrieve to the conscious arena, to the conscious field. So, recognition is one of the very important means of memorization. This is a chart which tells us how exactly the memory process works. So, there's a environmental input from as in the form of a sensory stores, which is either visual, auditory, or haptic. There are sensory messages which comes from a sense organs. If it is coming under the sensory memory, which gets decayed. Otherwise, when you go to the next term, which is the shortcut store, that is the short-term memory, there is a rehearsal which is happening. There's a coding, decision and the retrieval strategies which are being formed, and slowly that leads to our long-term store. So it's a process from our sense organs to the short-term memory, and which leads us to the long-term memory, which is otherwise called as permanent storehouse. So when you have a proper rehearsal, definitely the chances of forgetting is lesser and the resource output is really on a higher scale. And then when it goes to the long-term memory, then for the longer period of rehearsal is missing, the chances of forgetting is higher. So for example, I have a few data here. When you talk about the memory, I have few letters B, W, F, C, J. So if we can try out some of the exercises here, how far will you be able to remember these letters, which does not, these are nonsense syllables which doesn't have a meaning. How far are you able to remember those letters which were presented to you? So definitely the familiarity or the rehearsal help us to memorize things better, or the information gets much easier. And there is the other side which has a, sensible words of cat, dog, hat, mat, mask, and dot, which is easy for me to memorize. As I am familiar with the words, definitely it acts as one of the basic way of understanding the process. So this is otherwise again sensory memory, which has environmental stimuli, and then how it slowly leads to the long-term memory. So short-term memory or the sensory memory is a very immediate memory, which has the shortest duration of storing the information for a fraction of seconds to 2 seconds, and the registration is little difficult for the information to be erased. And the short-term memory is the next level of memory, which can be for 15 to 20 seconds, wherein the best example is remembering the phone number which is being called out, which can be stored with the use of or with proper rehearsal, which can be given to the long-term memory. These are the examples: 2359, 349835. So this is the duration for the short-term memory, and how far you are able to retrieve it tells your short-term memory. Then there is long-term memory, which is unlike the permanent storehouse of our information, with or with a very little decay, and it is a pattern which has a very good meaning and the characteristics of any of the information which is stored for a permanent basis. These are the types under long-term memory, episodic memory, which is dealing with the episodes and the events of one's own life, how what all has happened in one's own life gets stored in our episodic memory. And coming to the methods of memorization, there are many methods. One among them is recitation method, wherein the learner, without knowing or understanding the meaning, can learn or read the material and once, twice, thrice, and then without looking at the material, it is easier for the learner to evaluate himself. And there is a part and whole very common followed method in the learning memory, wherein the any for example any poem which is been having 4 to 5 stanzas are divided into part, and then equally part has been memorized individually, which is part method of one of the very clever method of memorization. Spaced and unspaced also is a disturbed practice of memorization, wherein subject is not able to memorize the assigned material in one sitting. Time after time, they take some of the stanza and then they try to practice it. There is a mnemonic technique, which is a Greek word, which means the aid to the memory, which help us for storing the information, to develop the information and build the memory little more insightful. There are some mnemonic techniques which we follow in everyday basis: peg word method, narrative chaining method, initial uh, letter strategies. Thank you so much for joining.